Hey there, interwebs. I hope you're all doing well. So I've talked about this a little bit on my social medias, but I wanted to do a video on it because I just needed to rant about my feelings about the cancellation of Star Wars: The Acolyte, and how it really, honestly, depresses me, and kind of what it speaks to our mainstream sort of storytelling and where it's going. So to start off, I hate that I have to say it this way, but like my opinions on Star Wars: The Acolyte, you can go and watch my reviews on it. I was deeply fascinated by it. I think Star Wars: The Acolyte had some of the most interesting ideas of any Star Wars show besides maybe Andor, and I would even argue it had better ideas than Andor on some levels. And I found it ultimately fascinating, the way it was discussing, the Jedi as being space cops, as being, sort of space Catholics as well, elements of, neoliberal governmental control, agents of neoliberal governmental control, and sort of a mix of all of those things, and basically being very critical of the Jedi as a result of that, and also in some really cool ways of like talking about how they press all other groups outside of the Jedi as dark side, when there's very clear different ideological and philosophical difference between someone like the Sith and the Force Witches, who have very clear different ideologies. One more very collectivist, very egalitarian, matriarchal, whereas the Sith generally seems to be very patriarchal, aggressive, violent, militaristic. But the Jedi just push those both as dark side, and I thought that those are really interesting ideas being displayed within the Acolyte. Unfortunately, the Acolyte was just not very clear and concise and articulate in discussing those things, and was not. It wasn't very clear in getting to those ideas in a way I found to be deep. And so, ultimately, while I liked The Acolyte and I liked its ideas, I found it to be a very frustrating show, but one I was ultimately really fascinated with, and one that I was really hoping would continue in a season 2, because number one, the show ended on not wrapping up any of its storylines, even though it very much could have, and leaving itself open for more discussions down the road, and in ways that I found to be very fascinating, like Moreland Dorr himself, coming in as a senator, I think had some of the most interesting ideas, despite him having only really one major scene in the entire show. I think he might have had another scene earlier, but like only one major scene in the show. And I'm like, I want to see more of that guy. I want to see more of that senator, because I'd be curious to see where that goes. And so like, I was very much interested in a season 2 and wanted there to be a season 2. That said, all of this goes into the context of the absolute worst, shittiest, vilest rhetoric around the Acolyte that we have seen over and over and over again. The Acolyte became kind of one of there are these shows that can pop up in the mainstream that become big galvanizers of the sort of racist, vile hate from certain segments of fandoms. I think a big one was like Lord of the Rings of Power, that all galvanized around like, oh, the black dwarves in Middle Earth, how could there be? The dwarves live underground, they wouldn't be black, or some whatever weird biological essentialism justification bullshit they put into fantasy nonsense. And the Acolyte was one of those too. And it kind of goes something to the YouTuber Sarah Z said, is that these people really like to find pieces of media that have things that you could understandably criticize about it, like the Acolyte. There's things I criticize about as well. Things like Rings of Power. Not a great show, though I'm really excited for season 2, but not a great show overall. And a lot of things worth criticizing about it, but use those reasonable criticisms to justify going into their other bigotry. It's like, well, this thing is bad because they have black doors, or because they're trying to hate men, or because blah, 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 blah. And so it's why you don't see something like Andor getting as much hate, because Andor, I think, was a much tighter work of art. But it also did have lesbians. It also did have a fairly diverse cast. But because it was a much tighter show, they couldn't get the criticisms in. And that's not saying it's okay. It's just sort of like the way they use like reasonable justification or criticisms to justify their bigotry and hate. What is frustrating is I see Kathleen Kennedy get all this vile hate, and yet I also do think she has mismanaged this franchise, because at every turn she is justifying these bigots. When she cancels The Acolyte, when they shift from the reaction from The Last Jedi to the nonsense, nostalgic bullshit that is The Rise of Skywalker, they are continually justifying these asshats. What I worry for the state of this franchise and other ones, we'll talk about Star Trek in a minute too, is how they are going to try to just kind of continually to make milquetoast content that again justifies the bigots the bigot's desires. Because I see a lot of people shocked at like the reaction to the Acolyte and being like, wouldn't you want more diverse Star Wars? Wouldn't you want more Star Wars projects out there? And the answer is no, because what these bigots want, they don't want to see stories that center marginalized perspectives. They don't want to see stories from the perspective of a Black person, of a queer person, of queer groups, like the Acolyte was doing. And they'll defend themselves and being like, look, we like other shows that have Black characters in it. And it's like, the point isn't that you dislike Black like characters, though you do hate Black characters and you send harassment at Black characters even in shows that you like. But their overall underlying attempt is to try to control and dominate the mainstream cultural conversation. The idea that only they get to be heroes. The idea that only they get to have their perspective centered. Because looking at The Acolyte, it is a show that is trying to center a differing perspective on the hegemonic culture of the Jedi. And as a result, a different perspective on the hegemonic culture of Star Wars and our actual real life world that Star Wars has very much always been talking about, the sort of neoliberalist government that George Lucas really wanted to go after, especially in the prequels, that the Acolyte is very much pulling from. And our perspective on that hegemonic culture is very distinct and different. And so to have a mainstream work of art center that perspective that is differing from the hegemonic culture threatens these people a lot. And if you go and listen to a lot of the rhetoric from these channels, you'll find them talking a lot about myth. Like these stories ruin our myths. Like Star Wars is meant to be our cultural myth of our heroes and our villains, and they decay and corrupt that by having shows like The Acolyte. And what they're really saying is that by having a perspective outside of the hegemonic norm, the centering it, putting it into the mainstream, having it be something that is propped up and centered, is threatening to the overall cultural message of, white men being the heroes, white men being the center, just the hegemonic culture always needing to perpetuate itself over and over again and can have no criticisms. It just needs to constantly repeat. Stories like this are threatening to that. And so, what I worry with the Star Wars franchise is that it is going to ultimately just make itself milquetoast to just constantly repeat that story over and over again. Like they're doing a Rey Skywalker movie, and the indications seem to be from some of the stuff released, like merchandise and stuff that's even come out, that they want Rey to like build in something new. Like she's not going to recreate the Jedi, she's going to do something new. And I worry that what they're going to do with that movie, it's going to get targeted for a lot of sexist hate. And the fact that they caved into, racist taste by not having Johnny Boyega there, though I don't even know if Johnny Boyega would even want to do it for all the bullshit hate, racist hate that he got. They've already caved in the movie because they're just having Rey, but then I doubt they're going to go very far in that movie to actually differentiate something different. And it will just be the Jedi 2.0. And that'll be the franchise moving forward. We're just going to do Jedi shit going forward, because that's what we can sell. That's what's not going to cause any controversy. But it's not going to push the franchise forward, and it's going to constantly have diminishing returns. And it's just a decay, and then Star Wars means nothing, as it's slowly been going. And it's frustrating because there have been elements of the Star Wars franchise that I've really liked. Hell, I'll even say the Book of Boba Fett even had some great stuff talking about indigenous cultures. The show was a mess, but it had some good stuff like that. Andor, fantastic. But it's notable to say that Andor is written by Tony Gilroy, a white dude, who like clearly understands imperialism, British imperial history, and other fights against like British imperialism and empire and things like that, and putting it into the show very much so. So he definitely understands all that stuff. But it is interesting that the perspective that is centered behind the scenes, not necessarily in front of the camera. It's just very saddening, and it's also very saddening to. I was looking at franchises that I care about, like with Star Trek. You see the cancellation of Star Trek Discovery, and along with the Acolyte, and you see these shows that have very Black-centric cast, Black leads, diverse cast generally, being canceled. And I know, the BIPOC fans that I know are really depressed seeing that, because it just goes to the anti-Blackness and generalized, racialized bigotry we have. And how these fascinating shows that, aren't perfect, but are interesting and trying to center a different perspective are just being shoved aside. And I always argue, too, that part of the reason that these shows are kind of messy is because they are trying to take franchises that have centered these perspectives for so long and trying to do something new with them, center a new perspective within them. And that's going to be messy. It's not going to fit the very clear rules of storytelling, and because it doesn't fit the very clear rules of storytelling, it's harder to get right, and people are figuring it out. And I think it's worthwhile. As much as I have issues with the Acolyte, I want to see it continue, because I think stories like it are worthwhile for us to see these perspectives on display, see how they're talked about, and maybe the next artist gets to do better. Like, certainly the Acolyte inspired me. I'm working on a script right now, hopefully, for a feature film that is very much inspired by ideas that are in the Acolyte and Star Wars Andor and things like that. And I think that we need these stories to inspire artists. People will take work and be inspired off of it, even if it's not perfect. And to remove those, especially for marginalized people, especially for people of color, is deeply saddening. And seeing that continue in sort of mainstream stuff is sad. But I also think that the Acolyte's cancellation just speaks to a really darker shift in how our mainstream media is handled today. I remember a time when I was growing up, and for a lot of the time throughout television and movie history, is that TV shows were allowed time to grow. Like, if you look at so many of my favorite shows, both in science fiction and elsewhere, they have a lot of horrible first seasons. Like Star Trek The Next Generation, holy shit, one of the worst first seasons of any science fiction show. I'm surprised it even got past the second frickin' episode, given how racist that was, or was Code of Honor the third. Either way, very rough first season. But I mean, looking out into things like a lot of my other favorite TV shows, like Parks and Rec, a terrible first season, but one of my favorite shows overall, even though I'm probably a little more jaded than when I first watched that show. And it just look back throughout so much of television history and see shows that were terrible in their first seasons, but because, they were allowed time to grow and renew, the writers were allowed to craft their characters, craft the storylines, build on what was working and remove what wasn't, and make something better. And we're not getting that with TV shows anymore. I am certain the Acolyte would have been better in season 2 than in season 1, just based on the fact that people were listening to criticism, willing to grow, seeing what worked, what didn't, the battles that they had to fight behind the scenes with executives, and they were willing to give up, and all of those things. And I think we need more TV shows just to be messy and allow them to grow. But if things aren't an instant, $1 million hit right away nowadays, they won't continue, because everything is just so high stakes all the time, because studios just send millions of dollars at TV shows, and it's like, well, if you don't make millions of dollars of return, then it's going to be terrible. It's why I want to, I'm sorry to talk about my own stuff, but I'm working on my show Identities to go and pitch it, and it's like, yeah, it's a science fiction show. I don't want it to have a huge budget, because I don't want the stakes to be that high for it. I want to be able to explore as a creator what I can do on a limited budget and think creatively that way. And also, if it doesn't make billions of dollars, then that's fine. Like, it won't need to be that high of a stakes. And I think that's worthwhile to have. I think there was someone who was talking about at the Oscars, is like, make a $1 million than one $10 million movie. I'd much rather have that. And I think we need to see more of that in Hollywood. But Hollywood just thinks like tech companies and needs always continually grow. And so their numbers need to be bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually you're going to get diminishing returns like we're seeing with Star Wars. That being said, I just want to end on a thing of hope here. Like, even though, like, we're talking always about Star Wars, Star Trek, these big sort of mainstream cultural mainstays, there is always going to be good, marginalized fiction being written. I read a bunch of books and find a bunch of like indie films by marginalized creators that I find are freaking fantastic. And they're always going to be there. I wish they'd be centered more. I wish they get more support. I wish we had more of them. And it is saddening to see them being pushed aside, shoved aside, not getting the support, not being able to get out there. But if you know where to look, it will be there. We always find ways to express ourselves, marginalized people do, in the gaps and the spaces and the liminality. And so we will always be there. And so I don't want people to think that that's not the case. But it just saddens me that these franchises that I really do love aren't willing to grow in the way that we need to push culture, the hegemonic culture, forward. Anyways, I just need to talk a little bit about the Acolyte, and hope you all live long and prosper, folks.